You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens.
And Chris White.
And our guest today is the Dr. Jason Keleher. Hi, Jason.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me here today, Chris and Mallory. And
hey, thanks for coming back.
We don't need to put "the" on there, I don't think.
Oh, no, come on.
It goes without saying.
Yes.
Today we're going to continue our conversation about sustainability. And last time we were talking about forever chemicals. Now I would like to talk about the plastic industry, which I think is similar in that we're producing large quantities, ever increasing amounts of plastic. And the plastic is ending up in the environment. So much of the plastic is not in fact recyclable. And this is actually a bone of contention for myself and for my wife, who is particularly upset about this because we all felt when we were younger that we were lied to. And the plastic industry told us it's perfectly fine for us to make these products because all you have to do is put them in the recycle bin and we'll just turn them into other plastic products. And the notion of this cradle to cradle is just fine, and we'll do that with the plastics. But it turned out actually not to be true.
Not that number plastic. Not that number plastic either.
And it turned out that they put this really clever triangular recycling symbol on the plastics to convince people that it could be recycled when in fact they knew that it could not be. And it's sorted by the type of plastic, has a different number associated with it. And what you heard Mallory talking about is that the only one that actually has any chance of being recycled is the number one, PET, polyethylene terephthalate. and the chemist and the biologist in the room are laughing at me because I have no idea how to pronounce the names of bioorganic molecules. Anyway, so I was hoping that we could help educate people a little bit about this issue. So, Dr. Keleher, what are your thoughts?
My first thought is it's terephthalate, but Dean White hasn't taken Orco at Lewis University, so we'll sign him up next fall for organic chemistry.
Yeah, can I just sit in on class?
Absolutely.
Audit it?
We welcome you.
All right.
I think framing this problem or framing this thing is really important, and I think you feel like you were sold that all these plastics could be recycled and we would have a life cycle of sustainability and so on. But I don't think it's just the plastic itself nowadays. I think as we talk about in the previous podcast before about polymers, the molecular chains that are used in making these are super complex, and they do lead to problems with the decomposition. And that's just kind of level one. It makes the job hard enough that they're polymers. But there's also a big push for additive manufacturing, increased toughness, change the ability for light to penetrate the plastic. And that's not all a product of the polymer itself. It's a product of the additives that you put in the polymer. So now you have a situation where you have made a plastic that is a polymer. You have an additive now. The additive improves the durability, the what have you, and then you change the lifetime of degradation for that plastic to be recycled.
Could you take just a second and tell everybody what a polymer actually is?
Yep.
So why is plastic plastic?
Why is plastic plastic? So if you think about a single molecule by itself, you may not be able to see it in an assembly. You may not be able to touch it, feel it. It's not something that's kind of tangible. As you connect these smaller molecules together piece by piece through whatever reaction we use, they create a larger, more uniform network that tends to have rigidity or structure to it. So a polymer is many molecules together in harmony to create a network that can do something productive, or in this case, maybe not so productive after the fact, right?
How I explain it to my students in class is like the monomers, the single molecules, are like the Lego building blocks. Yeah. And then you put them together and you get the pirate ship or the spaceship, and that's the polymer. Yeah. So individually, the subunits don't do a lot for you, but when you assemble them together into the polymer form, then you have something functional.
Okay, so it's already been established that I know absolutely nothing about organic chemistry.
But you do know about
But-
Legos.
You do know, like,
I know. So, but this is my problem. You just use this analogy of Legos, but I can constantly take my Legos apart and put them back together again. So what's the problem?
You can break covalent bonds in the polymer, but you still have the Legos.
the sum. It could be also that the sum of the singular parts create a structure that is more productive, therefore more complicated to break down.
Is it also possible that as I break apart my Legos, as I break apart the polymer back into smaller pieces, I'm actually changing what the monomer is itself?
You would hope that you're not, but the answer could be yes, you are.
Because I think I likely have to use heat at some point in order to break the polymer down.
Heat.
And will that heat then impact the chemical structure of the of the molecules itself?
The answer is yes, and I think we should maybe even liken it more to not just heat, but energy in general, because you can have heat breakdown or light breakdown too. So energy on itself can create bond breaking events. Those bond breaking events can then reform.
So it's almost as if when I put the Legos together, I glued them. And now that I'm trying to take them apart, they don't come apart necessarily in a way which allows them to be reassembled easily back into something else.
Especially if you want to use them for an application where you don't want them to fall apart.
So the issue is when I have my plastic water bottle, it's so much easier just to make fresh, new PET rather than trying to rip apart the Lego set and reassemble it into a new bottle.
Yeah, have you ever tried to get like two flat Legos apart? It's insanely difficult.
Wait a
I
minute.
agree with that.
You sound like a woman who has a small child at home.
And a lot of Legos.
And a lot of
So yeah, that helps. That helps me.
Yeah, and I think you can also rationalize it that you have to put energy in to make the polymer. You have to put energy in to break the polymer as well, right? So what is that energy source cost?
Right, because
well?
the recycling is, takes more energy to recycle, and therefore that's not a carbon neutral process based on how we get energy currently.
So even if we could break down the polymers back into their individual Lego-sized pieces and then reassemble them, what you're suggesting is that's likely an energy-intensive process.
Yep.
So the cradle-to-cradle idea of using oil to create plastics, and then once I've created this plastic, I will be able to reform it into other plastics forever and ever, doesn't work the way that I thought it did.
I think that's a fair statement, but we can frame it even a little bit more for you, okay? So let's say something that may not be very popular, but what if I have a water bottle in the ocean floating? Warm ocean degradation will happen, right? There's heat, there's sun, there's light. And that of plastic will eventually get broken down. And you go from what I'll call a macroplastic bottle. But the problem is now the additives that provide rigidity and the additives that provide structure and the additive that provide function that have been put into the plastic, they will be released as well. So you go now from having macroplastics to microplastics, right? So you have now a secondary source in the degradation process.
How big is a microplastic? What's a scale range that you're talking about?
Depends on what's in there, but you're talking, bottle, to sub, microns, nanometers.
Stuff they can actually find in blood of living organisms. So quite small.
So basically, wait a minute. So you just said that a tiny piece of a water bottle might be floating around in my blood right now.
Yes.
And probably more than one.
Oh, yes. A lot.
Doesn't my body care?
I think it does. You're not having an immune response to it, but it doesn't mean it's not having other side effects, or whatever additives were in there and still clinging are not. They're potentially having a side effect in your body.
And microplastics are significantly more important to understand because tracking and monitoring them are hard, right? The toxicity that can come from smaller pieces of foreign substance, right, have greater toxicity and chemical composition changes, way higher human health, plant risks, and obviously there has different regulatory things that have to be brought upon with microplastics versus macroplastics.
Yeah, it's. I think I used to think microplastics when I was younger. You know, if you get a scrubbing face wash and it has those tiny little plastic beads in it, I was like, oh, that's a microplastic. And then it's like, no, smaller than a cell.
So you can't even see them. When you're talking about the microplastics, they're so small. And the beads that are in the the exfoliation, products will break down even finer.
Yep.
And
we're directly washing those into our water supply.
And the water treatment facilities do not have the technology at this point to filter out all the microplastics. So it just gets flushed into the river, into the water system, maybe percolates down into the aquifers.
And just the plastic that's out there that's breaking down, in landfills. And everyone knows there's Trash Island in the ocean where it's just a sea of plastic out there.
And getting larger. Yeah, the plastic vortex. and from a disposal, so much of the plastic we use is single use. It isn't economically viable to turn it into anything else, so it just gets landfilled. It used to be that we would fill up container ships of plastic and send them off to other countries and let them deal with it. And there's been so many documentaries I've seen on TV about third world countries and poor neighborhoods in third world countries, so the poorest of the poor, who are basically being told to deal with our plastic waste.
Yeah.
Are there alternatives? Are there biodegradable plastics? And why don't we use those if they exist?
This is a shout out, obviously, to the chemists and polymer engineers. There's a significant amount of work being done across the country on biodegradable plastics. Many centers across the U.S. at many high-quality research institutions are focusing on creating plastics that have rigidity, but then have bond-breaking processes that can be triggered under certain energy sources or thermal regimes that will degrade them rapidly. So rapidly degrading plastics.
Do they also include all of these, other chemicals that you were referring to earlier?
I think that the additives are also being focused on. So there's a whole push for additive manufacturing changes as well. So not necessarily using traditional additives, but more, again, bio-friendly, biomimetic additives that have less, overall toxicity.
So how am I supposed to know if they are lying to me now? Because I remember when this whole, biodegradable plastic thing came out. Actually, what they did was simply create plastics that broke into small pieces. And then because it broke into small pieces, they said it was biodegradable. It was no longer a macroscopic piece of plastic. It was a whole bunch of tiny micro-sized pieces of plastic. Yeah. And therefore, I couldn't see it. Therefore, it says, you don't have to worry about it because you can't see it anymore. And then people called their bluff on that when they went, oh, yeah, okay, fine. So we'll go and try to use corn oil or various other things.
Yeah, I think I saw a commercial this morning for compostable lunch bags.
Yes.
But the key to all of those things, they say, when disposed of properly or composted properly. You can't just put it in the recycling
I have a compost
bin.
pile in my backyard. Can I just toss it in? I actually did that once a few years ago, and then a year later, it still looked like a cup to me.
Yeah, you got to do it properly. I'm not entirely sure for those biodegradable lunch bags what proper composting of them is. Hopefully they come with instructions. I don't know.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't wish to, denigrate the industry, because I know, Jason, to your point, there are hundreds and thousands of chemists that are honestly and sincerely trying to do the right thing and to create compounds that make life easier for us humans, while at the same time doing it in a way which won't lead to our demise. And I guess what I'm saying is to those of you out there listening, a healthy dose of skepticism is always worthwhile, and to ask questions. It's not that everybody's out to get you, but it does I think matter to be a skeptic. That's what scientists do all the time. we're constantly asking questions. Well, how do I know that what you're telling me is correct? And is there a way that I can validate and verify that what you're telling me is true?
That's why we want to see the data, so we can make data-driven decisions, not just word of mouth.
And validate it with multiple sources.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why when we publish research, we have to put in conflict of interest statements, so people reading it will know if we have a vested interest in the research, so they can decide how skeptical they should be about it based on that.
And then be able to figure out how to filter out the crazies.
That's the hardest part.
I think it's strategy and education. I think it's strategy and education at all times.
And because I was going to say there's always people out there that are trying to sell you something, and they're not afraid to lie to you.
Yep.
Yeah. And being a skeptic is fine as long as the right information is being processed and presented.
Yeah, information literacy.
100%.
You learn that in college, or we try to teach that in college, so that you can look at your sources and decide if they're reliable and glean from multiple sources and not just one.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Anything? Any final comments about plastics?
No, I think it's all, like I said, again, it's all about making sure we design with intent and educate the community.
So the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Lewis University. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The Lewis University name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. This podcast was produced in the WLRA podcast studios at Lewis University. Visit lewisu.edu for more information about Lewis University. You've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens.
And Chris White.
And
Jason Keleher.
Thanks.
See you next time.